First, let's add in another particle object, and I'm going to call this emitter _1, and we're going to select a partigon emitter and click OK. I'm going to close out our effects emitter and just move this up a little bit higher in our scene. And now we currently have no forces or anything affecting our object. And I do want to make the time frame a little bit longer for this animation, so I'm going to change our timeline to 300 frames, open up our object properties, go to the Dynamics tab, and set our particle lifetime to 300 frames. Go to our generator option and set our particle limit to 10,000. And that way we have enough particles throughout our scene in order to generate what it is that we need. The first thing I want to take a look at and show you is the gravity. So let's go ahead and select gravity, and we can keep the name at the default of gravity. Now this is an extremely straightforward effector that we have, and effects option, and basically we can set the group, and we'll go ahead and change that in just a minute. Our size effect is based on gravity. We also have a regional effect that we can set up. We have different types of gravity: our direction, point, and two-pole. First, we're going to start out with direction. We also have a Falloff Mode, inverse distance, and linear. I'm going to keep our Falloff Mode at off. And now we're going to move down to the more common settings where we can take a look at radius. And right now, the gravity is only going to affect our particles within a certain area. With a radius of 1, we're still seeing it affect the entire scene. We can go ahead and increase the radius to 3. You can see that a little bit larger. And the overall effects. I want to close out this property panel, and we're going to use the object properties, and we're also going to set up a group for this. So let's go to object properties, and first I'm going to select our emitter, and if we go to group, I'm going to select new group, and I first just want to call this group _1 and click OK. And now our particles are in a different group from our gravity. But of course, since our gravity is set up as the default, it is going to affect every group. So let's change our object to the gravity, and I'm going to create a new group, and I'm going to call this group 2. Group _2, and click OK. And now we have the gravity set to a different group. And now we can see that that gravity is no longer affecting our object and our particles in the scene, because they are in separate groups. If I change that to group 1, now we're affecting all of the objects that will be within group 1. Go back and we can set our radius to 1 on our gravity. And we can see that. And basically the overall visual display of that gravity. I can also hit calculate if we want to be more precise about how this gravity is affecting our object. And let's take a look at our settings. Our power is going to be our global amount that controls the parameters underneath the actual gravity amount. So our gravity right now is set to -1. And if I increase our power to 200, we can see that stretching our gravity display, and also increasing that power of 1 basically up to the value of 2. So I've set our power down to 100% and our value to -2. We're going to see the same sort of an effect. So that's just our global way of controlling these amounts on the X, Y, and Z. If I change our Y to 0, we're going to make this object ineffective and basically not affecting anything. If we go to the X value, I can set that to 1. And now we can see our gravity is flowing on the X axis. We can also control multiple axes. And now we're going kind of off to an angle. And we can also see the display of our gravity showing exactly which direction it is headed. I'm going to change these values back to the default, so -1 on the y and 0 on the other axes. And let's take a look at some of our other settings. We have a Falloff Mode. We can set that to a linear fall-off. And now we're not seeing the effect of that gravity on our scene. If we change our radius to 3, and actually we'll go ahead and bring that up to 4 so we can engulf that a little bit more. Now we can see that the region of our gravity object itself is directly affecting the object. So if I decrease our radius to 2, where we're not really intersecting with the particle object, we're only really pulling out those particles on the bottom. And then of course once we go past it, we will see those kind of fall off on the bottom. And now with linear, it's going to be a constant rate throughout this object. If we do inverse distance, it's going to affect it a little bit differently. And I'm going to go ahead and increase our radius up to 4 again. And now we can scrub through, and basically what we'll see is the center of the object is going to have a greater power of gravity than the outer edges, which we can also see within our display, where we have much longer lines within the center of our object and then shorter lines on the outside. So our inverse distance will basically be a way of controlling our gravity with a sphere or a box, with increased gravity towards the center and decreased gravity on the outside. We can also do the opposite of an effect by making our power -100. And now our particles are going to be flowing upward, basically as if we would have set the value of y to a +1 rather than a negative. So go back and set our power to 100%. Change our Falloff Mode to off, and that way we're affecting all of our particles and everything completely separate from our radius. And we also have different types of gravity modes. We can go to a point gravity mode, and now we can see this is expanding outward, or we can go inward. So let's go ahead and set this to a value of 1 on the y. And we're not seeing too much of a change there. What I do want to do is bring down the position of our emitter object towards the center. And now if we scrub through, we can see that gravity is working sort of as an explosion object, where the point is the center of our gravity. We'll go ahead and select that. And then it's going to be expanding everything outward from that area. And if we change these to negative values, it's going to start to basically suck everything into the inside of that object. And we can start to see it spray out the other side. So if I bring up our emitter object a little bit higher, and now we scrub through, we're going to see everything going towards the center of our gravity and giving the exact opposite sort of an effect. And it does look similar to the way the target object was working before, except now we have gravity and we have particles kind of spraying off in different directions. And that's a pretty cool effect that we have there. I'm going to go back to our gravity and change this to the two-pole method. Now this is going to work a little bit differently. And if we take a look at the way our gravity display is showing up, basically we have a variation of our gravity throughout this object. I'll set our power back up to 100, and we'll do a -1 on the y, so we're kind of back to default. And I also want to take our emitter object and bring that back towards the center. And now we can see that we're going to get some different effects for our gravity. We'll go ahead and change that back to our gravity object, and we can scale that down to see it just a little bit better. We'll do 2 meters, and we can also see the OpenGL display change a little bit more. And it gives us a nice variation. We'll go ahead and increase the size of our generator for our emitter. Make it a little bit larger. And maybe we need to create a little bit of a larger effect on the Y. Go ahead and do that to 4. And that way we can equally create particles on both sides of our gravity. And now we can see the pull effect. And then we can do the opposite by changing the gravity to a negative value on its power. And now we're going up more towards that top pole. And then we also have a size effect. We can base that on region. And I also want to change this back to our directional mode. And we're not really going to be taking a look too much at our size effect right now, because we want to go into the object properties for that and actually look at the particles themselves and how the size will change before we really take a look at that within gravity. So that's our overall gravity. And now let's take a look at our wind options. And there's a lot we can do with particles by using different wind types. So I'm going to remove our gravity from the scene entirely, select our emitter object, and change its generator size down to 1. And now let's go ahead and add in a wind object. And we can keep the name wind as our default. And we want this to be part of our group 1, and that way it's directly affecting our emitter object. And now we have a couple of different wind types, or actually several to choose from. There's direction, which is going to work similar to our gravity option. We can also set different blend modes where we want to add. We can do max, overwrite, heavy wind. And that's going to be a little more important when we have different types of wind in the scene affecting the same types of objects, and also with our gravity. We have a Falloff Mode, which is basically the same as our gravity. So if I set this to off, then we're going to have the exact same effect as gravity. Linear is going to be our default, and that way we can see our resistance of our particle. We can do an inverse distance, where we have a change throughout our object, and then distance itself, which is going to be in relation to how far away the particles will travel away from the radius of our wind object. Go ahead and set that back to linear. We also have the size effect, which is wind and region. So just like we had with the gravity. And we can also see we have a vector amount. The vector is going to basically set the direction of our wind. If we set this to -1, then we're going to start to pull our particles down. And that works just like all of the other X, Y, Z options that we have for different vectors on all the other settings. Now, right now we're set to direction, so we have that vector where we control our direction. We also have an explosion option, and that way we can explode our particles outward. And of course, the size of this is really going to affect the overall value of how far our particles will continue to explode. So let's change our radius to 3. I'm going to cancel that create motion key, which I pulled up by hitting enter too many times. And now we can see that the wind will affect a much larger radius and area of our particles. We also have a power amount, which is going to control that overall, in this case not the vector, but if we did have vector up, it would control that. So our power is going to be set to 200. And now we can increase the explosion amount and how quickly we are pulling these particles out. Set that back to 100. And keep in mind that we can also set envelopes for this as well to create a variation over time and keyframe that. Our next option is rotation on the Y-axis. And now we can create sort of a tornado effect where our particles are going to rotate around. If we take a look in the OpenGL above our object, we can see it spinning on the y-axis, and we can just see all of those particles rotating upward throughout our wind object. So if I pull down or bring up our wind object a little bit higher so that our particles are starting at the bottom of this effect, we can see that expanding a little bit further, and we just have a nice rotation on that axis. Now keep in mind we can also rotate this object to a different direction, and now we can see that overall change because of the rotation. So it's not fixed directly on the Y because of course we can rotate our object, but to start out with default, it is going to shoot everything upward on that y-axis. We also have a cylinder type explosion. I'm going to go ahead and also change the movement back to kind of where we were, where it's almost centered. And now we have it exploding in the shape of a cylinder. And we can see the lines showing up to really demonstrate what that's going to look like. I'll increase our power to a very high amount of 500 so we can see that OpenGL display a little bit better, and you can really tell what this wind is going to be doing. And we can see how that's pulling it out and giving us more of a disk shape to our particle object. We also have Turbulence, which is going to change over time and just give us a little bit of variation throughout the animation. And if we take a look a little bit higher, we can just see that turbulence and sort of a wavy effect with this wind. And that's kind of a neat option for manipulating our particles. We also have the donut, and we can see that shape is a torus. Change our power down to 100. And because this is based on the actual position of our wind, we can generate a lot of different effects by changing the overall position. So I can move this over to the side a little, and now we're going to see that kind of rotate outward and form the side of that donut shape. We can also decrease the scale and the size of this to change that effect a little bit more. And the nice thing about the wind effector is we can use the scale within our regular options. We're going to make sure we're in scale and not stretch. And now we can change the size, and we're going to see that it's really affecting more of the power than it is the actual size of our object. So keep in mind with our radius and scales, we do want to keep mostly separate. We also have a drag function, which we're going to take a look at a little bit later, and how that is going to affect our particles. But let's go ahead and just select and drag our timeline in a little more. Go to the move option, and if we drag this, we can see it's just kind of dragging our particles along with it. So it's kind of a neat effect with the drag, and there's a lot we can do if we create a more complex animation. I'll go ahead and delete that last key, get rid of that motion, and we also have something that's random, which is just going to randomly throw around our particles in different directions, and we can see how each of these little options are just kind of spinning as we drag through the animation. And then there's also the vortex, which will also spin around and give us a pretty neat looking effect. There's sticky wind, which is going to work similarly to the drag function. There's a hemisphere, where we only affect a certain area, much smaller, with just a half cylinder. And then we also have a path option and an animation path. So path option, we can set up our wind to follow along an animation path. Go ahead and move that, and now we can see how that is pulling along our particles and is moving along that path. But the really cool one for working with paths is definitely animation path. And we'll go ahead and switch to that. Now it's going to ask if we'd like to make our path items. And we're going to click OK. And what this is going to do is create two different null objects. And now we can see it's going from one null to the other. And we're going to select our handles, which they are named, each of our null objects. The base is handle 1, and the top one is going to be handle 2. Now what we can do is move this, and this is not directly related to keyframes as the regular path, and we're going to be creating an animation path for these particles to move along. So now we're just moving this up with just these two objects, but it's not very interesting. We can still kind of achieve this effect with other wind. So what we want to do is clone this object, which we can do by hitting Control-C, click OK, and now it's created automatically handle 3 and a new null, and it's automatically connected to our other object. And what we can start to do is make a path for these particles to follow. Clone handle 3 to create handle 4. And then we can clone that again to create handle 5 and just kind of pull that out. And now we have a fairly interesting animation path. And if we start to scrub through our animation, we can see that those particles will follow along that path. I'm also going to increase our frame amount just to 500. Go to our object properties and select our emitter and make sure that it is also going to continue to 500 frames. We can scrub through our animation and see that following all the way to the end. Now, there's a lot we can do with this animation path by controlling our nulls in different ways. Now, one thing that really affects the motion is the size of our nulls, and also the size of our emitter. Right now we're completely inside this wind object. If I was to make our emitter much larger, then only the particles that are within the object will be directly affected. Let's go to our emitter, and I'm going to increase the generator size to 2 meters on the X and on the Z to make it a little bit larger. And we can see we're still within the object. Let's go beyond it and set it to 6. And now we can see that the particles are mostly following along within that path, but we'll start to notice less of an influence on the outer edges. And I am going to make the size a little bit larger, up to 8 meters. And now we can see that there are some particles that are left behind because they're not within the path. But we have a really neat looking animation going on, so we'll go ahead and reduce that generator size to 4 and take a look at the other ways we can affect our nulls and manipulate this animation. Now, one thing we can do is if we select our null, and I'm going to select our handle 3. Of course, we can animate this over time and position our nulls in different directions to create an interesting looking animation. But there are some other things we can also do with these nulls to adjust our wind and the overall shape. If we switch to scale and now size down the null, we're going to see that we have a smaller area within our wind object, and it will start to compress our particles into that space. And that's a really neat effect that we can do, and of course that can also be animated. If we expand that a little larger, we see that it will start to pull out those particles a little bit farther. And what we can also do is adjust rotation. So select our first null, switch to rotation, and I'm going to start to rotate this object around. Actually, handle 5, which is technically our last null. And if we start to move through our animation, we're going to see that towards the end, they're all going to start to spin. We're going to select handle 3 now and create even more of a variation. And because the rotation is not constant throughout each of these different nulls, because they are being rotated separately, we're going to see a quick bit of rotation, and then it's going to go back to the way it was previously set. So if you want to continue with a rotation, you need to make sure that you select each of your objects and rotate them to match up with the flow. And now we have a really interesting looking particle effect. And we could also adjust the rotation on handle 2 and get that to kind of blend a little differently. I'm going to make sure I select the heading. And now we have it twisting and turning in different directions, something that's not constant, and it'll give us a very interesting looking effect. We can also see that some of our particles are going to be outside of the wind, which means they're going to stay still, as we can mostly see in this area right here. So what we would need to do is select our object and change the emitter size, the generator size, and go ahead and set that Y back to 1 and all the X and Z to 3. And now we're a little bit more within the motion, and we can see it a little bit better. And this is a really cool way that we can create a lot of different effects, including tornadoes. If we hit calculate, we can see it a little bit better, and it's going to give us a more accurate representation of how this is being affected by our wind. And it'll also move much quicker now, because those particles will not need to be continually calculated while we're scrubbing through the timeline, and the response of the system will be much faster. So this is an extremely cool wind option that we have, just creating these different nulls. And if we wanted to increase that path, we can take our last handle, clone it once again, and pull that out, and maybe change its direction. And of course we can also change the scale and squish that down, and just end up with some very, very complex effects. And that will work with both HV particles and regular ones.